This is the Planetary Potential Podcast for those who are eager to explore entrepreneurship, innovation, and cross-cultural communication in exciting and interesting places around the world. And now, here's your host, Andrew P. Rowan.
Welcome to episode 18 of season 1. What can you learn about yourself, your hometown, and your country by living somewhere else? This week, we're joined by Diego Centurion Tapia, who returned to Peru after almost a decade in Europe and Asia. In our interview, we discuss what it was like juxtaposing European and Asian experiences, looking at Peru through a shifting lens, and similarities between Southeast Asia and Latin America. An important reminder that opinions shared on this episode are those of individual guests. For more information, please visit www.andrewprowan.com/disclosures. Diego and I also discuss my impressions of Lima, how we met, and insights from his time in Beijing. Let's get started.
With me is Diego Centurion Tapia, and we are in Lince in Lima. It's a section of Lima at an undisclosed location. And interestingly enough, Diego and I met at the Lima FinTech Forum, which was last month, and we met during, let's say, serendipitous circumstances.
That's right.
He thought I was somebody else, and then when he approached me, I thought he was somebody else. And it turns out we were both wrong.
Yeah.
But at that time, I happened to be wearing a batik. And because Diego has lived and worked in Asia, he knew that the attire was Indonesian.
That's
so
right.
Of course, we started talking.
That was a dead giveaway.
Yeah. And actually, he was one of two people who noticed. The other person who noticed had lived in Indonesia. And I was surprised, of course, because I didn't expect people in Peru.
Well, what do you know, friend?
To recognize, but that just goes to show you what are the kind of flows of people today. So welcome,
Absolutely.
Diego. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate the opportunity.
So we've had the chance now over several weeks to get to know each other a bit better. Of course, we were together with some mutual friends and contacts on Wednesday, and it was a good group.
Yeah.
We were Peruvian, of course, German, Indian, and Americans.
Swedish and American, I think.
Oh, that's right. Swedish and Americans. I always think of Frederick as a
German name,
German
right?
name, but you're absolutely right. And it turns out that there were several, I think, common experiences among us, even though we came from very different places geographically.
Absolutely. Yes.
And of course, you and I also, we've both spent time in Asia. Me, of course, in Vietnam, and you in Singapore and in China.
That's
in
correct.
Beijing. And you visited Vietnam while you were based in Asia, correct?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And so can you share a bit about what initially drew you to Asia in the first place, and then what it was that you were working on while out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So you see, my interest in Asia is actually pretty long-standing in the sense that I went to university with a few of the friends that I met in university had been brought up in Asia, right? Mostly as expats, right? So I had heard great things about both Hong Kong and Singapore. It seemed to me like an exciting place. So when I returned to Europe in 2011 for a master's degree on international business and emerging markets, I figured I would have a crack at relocating to Asia after my degree, right? So after a few applications, I ended up landing a role at a large German bank called Commerzbank out of Singapore. So I moved to Asia by the end of 2012, and I stayed in Singapore until the end of till mid 2016. And after that, I moved to China, Beijing, for about a year and a half.
And so then you just recently moved back
That's correct.
to Lima.
Correct.
And you've been here for how long now?
Roughly 6 months.
Roughly 6 months. So how does it feel? Do you feel like Lima has changed in the time that you've been away? Do you feel like you were here yesterday? Do you find yourself missing parts and experiences of Asia?
I do, absolutely. No, Asia has a special place in my heart for sure. I think it was a very formative period of time that I spent there. But going back to your question, I think Lima has changed a great deal over the last few years. It has gotten considered more expensive one, but additionally, I find it to be in a period of transition, right? I think the city is maturing. I find it to be more livable, to be fairly honest, than it was a few years ago. livable in the sense that there's a little more concern about providing citizens of Lima or dwellers with a slightly better day-to-day experience, right? Like for example, this is a street that we see out here, on Arequipa. It used to have very hellish traffic, right? Loud, it was dangerous, loud, constantly crowded. On Sundays, they close it off from beginning to end from 7 a.m. to 1 p.m., right? So you see people, like rollerblading, jogging and so on. And that to me is quality of life that was not afforded before, and it is now. So it's a bit of a vision now that's permeating, authorities that, it's about making the city a little more livable for the 10 million inhabitants, right? So actually I find now Lima to be properly middle income. That's my perception of it, which was not before.
So has your time in Asia helped to change the way you look at situations here when you're back in Lima, in the sense that, my time in Asia really helped me to see things from a different perspective. One of the kind of key realizations was that we could have access to the same set of facts and the same set of information and data,
right,
and then arrive to completely different conclusions as a result of that. And I experienced that very clearly in Vietnam and the work environment there. So curious if you maybe not had the same experience, but did you have similar experiences where something that should be obvious or logical to you, in that situation, it wasn't, or like it made sense to you, but for everybody else in that situation, you were the one who was out of order.
Right. Okay. Let me see if I understand you correctly. So the first part of what you're saying is whether spending time in Asia has shaped my view in some way, right? And I would say absolutely yes, it has. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I credit the most to having lived in Asia is a very personal thing, in the sense that I now view my surroundings very differently, right? I was fortunate enough to get my education in both Europe and the US, right? I had the luck to attend pretty good schools, and I remember, like, also I was younger. Now I'm 33 now, but I remember I used to think that the solutions that we had to implement here in Peru for the country to thrive, to prosper, to get ahead, they had to in some way resemble what the policy or the recipe in the West is, right? Now, living in Asia has completely shattered that, and for the better, I would say. I think living in Asia has shown me that you can extract, you can identify and extract and sort of replicate good experiences.
Yeah.
But they have to be localized, right? They have to be put in context.
Okay.
I think countries like Vietnam or Thailand, right, Cambodia, they're amazing success stories in their own right. And much of their success is or the way I see it is due to the fact that they've taken what's good in the West, right, and they've kind of made it local, right, and they have their own challenges and so on, and yet they're getting ahead, and that to me has been a fundamental change, because, as I said, I used to think that if we're not trying to resemble the West in some way, then it's not valid, but now I don't think that anymore. I think that we're never going to be Denmark, and that's great. And we shouldn't be Denmark. We shouldn't aspire to be something like, no, we're simply not, made of the same stuff.
Yeah.
For me, my time in Asia has taught me that we have to come up with our own solutions, right? Because there are countries out there with numerous challenges, a lot of them a lot more dire than our own.
Mm-hmm.
And they are pulling ahead with their own recipes, right? Like maintaining a local identity. So that to me is a major advancement in my own way of thinking.
Yeah.
Right? I see Asia as an example. As a matter of fact, I find Asia to be more relatable to Peru than the West, despite the fact that, we speak Spanish here and so on. We have this cultural heritage that comes from Europe in some way. But in terms of the challenges, right, population challenges, access to technology, access to healthcare, access to education, I think we're a little closer to Asia, and we should view them as an example. I actually tend to speak about Vietnam a lot, as a matter of fact, when people ask me, right? Because I see Vietnam as a great example of having to kind of rebuild itself, right, after the war period. And then now is poised to become a very large economy, right? It's booming. And yeah, I think we should be looking at that rather than many, Western examples.
Okay, so then in the Peruvian context,
Right.
do you still see that opportunity today to transition or to reorient Peru's direction to incorporate more Asia-centric principles in terms of growth and development? Or do you see that transition already happening, like in the time that you've been away?
I think that it's going to become it will happen, right? I find that to be like we're kind of like in that direction. I think to a large extent is because of the level of investment, right? So I think if you follow the money, that's a good indicator. And now you see very intense investment, intense funding coming from Asia, right?
Yeah.
You see Didi is looking to set up here in Peru. They're already in Mexico. You find other Asian companies and startups looking to set up shop here. So that is definitely going to like draw the consumers' attention or just the people's attention to what's happening there, right?
Yeah.
I think it's only going to become stronger.
So in that sense, because you've had experience in Asia, do you see yourself as a potential bridge builder or an ambassador between Asia and Peru, or for example, Singapore and Greater Southeast Asia, or China and Peru and South America or Latin America?
Yeah, it's really all about the timing, I would say. Like back when I was living in Singapore, for example, let me tell you a quick story. I was working for a bank, right? I was working for a large German bank, and one of the things that I thought could work out was to start offering private banking services to high net worth individuals in Latin America, right? Like build some sort of bridge between affluent population in Latin America that needed banking services and what's offered in places like Hong Kong and Singapore, right? As it turns out, this was back in 2014. The ties between the markets were still very incipient, right? In the realm of private banking and wealth management, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't really find much of an opportunity for that at that time, right? So I think really all about the timing, because if you think, places like Singapore, they offer a great, fine array of services, right? In wealth management to clients all over the world. They focus mostly in North Asia. That's kind of like banking is, like private banking jargon from China, basically, right?
Okay.
So there wasn't yet this connection, but I think I would definitely see myself try to build these connections and bring them closer. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so if I recall correctly, during one of our conversations, we spoke a bit about China's interests in not only Latin America, but the relationship between China and Peru. And at that time, you had shared some stories, some discussions that you've had with Chinese citizens about how they view Peru through the lens of civilization.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, yeah, let me share a story with you. So the time that I spent in China, I happened to be neighbors with one of the Peruvian diplomats, right? We live in the same compound in Beijing, and shortly after my arrival, they were celebrating Peru's National Independence Day, which is in July, right? It's coming soon. And the thing is, having lived abroad for many years and having been based in several countries, I have attended these events before, and they tend to be really modest, right? That's the truth. I mean, they're just, made for the small Peruvian community in places like Singapore or, like London and so on. Like, they're nothing out of the ordinary. If anything, they're small, right? This, however, was, I would say, a fixture in the diplomatic calendar of Beijing, which is a big deal, because Beijing, you have to think of Beijing in the same terms that you think of Washington, D.C. Yeah. It has the same density of diplomats, right? They have their own investment bank, the Asian, they have their own World Bank knockoff, so to say, right? Not just a knockoff, I mean, like it has a different institution, right? But you have numerous diplomats there, right? So sure. In terms of diplomatic weight, is akin to Washington, I would say. And the Peruvian National Day was a big event. And I remember the first time I went there, they had rented out this large hotel, right? Like very expensive place. And it was a very fine reception. I honestly did not expect it to be, so fanciful, right?
Yeah.
And the thing is, they managed to read the Chinese right because they assess you in terms of how much money you display. That's the truth, right?
Yeah.
They will make an opinion of you based on how wealthy you appear to be, how good have you done in life, right? How well have you performed? So they managed to understand that. So they knew that in order for China for them to become prominent in China's radar, they had to make a big display, right? And at the same time, I saw a lot of interest from Chinese diplomats also attending these events. I attended two of these events, 2016, 2017, and I can see that there's it plays a real importance in diplomatic relations with Peru, right? Like they had students from the Chinese Conservatory of Music performing Peruvian music in Chinese instruments, like something very bizarre, right? Unreal almost. And they place great interest in nurturing relations with Peru, to a large extent because they see us as a natural partner, right? And not only has Peru been a recipient of Chinese immigration in the past, right? But on top of that, going more to what you were hinting, right? I've been told by more than for a handful of fellows that China views Peru as a survivor, the same way they view themselves, right? So China tends to think of itself in terms of civilization, right? And China looks at the big picture. They say we've been around for 5,000 plus years, right? We remain essentially Chinese, right? The same civilization over, going through all these challenges, right? Undergoing all these transformations. It's as if the Romans were alive today, or the Egyptians were alive today, the way we think of them in the past, right? So they see themselves as survivors, and they see Peruvians, the Incas, right? The heirs of the Inca Empire, also survivors. So in that sense, they have a bit of a special relation to us because they think you guys have endured time. You guys know what it's like to endure in time. I'm not talking about 50 or 100 years. I'm talking about millennia here.
Yeah.
Right. Which to me was a big eye opener. Right. So we do have a very special relation with China. They back when the previous president Kuczynski, he visited, it was very close to one of the Chinese public holidays, because they don't have like one day here and there. They kind of like box them up, and so you go on holiday for 7 days, or right. That's why there's some massive migrations all the time, and yet they welcome him, right? Which is something that you don't really see often, right? That they would rather reschedule. So you see small things here and there that actually are very telling of how China, the level of appreciation they have for Peru. I think they still exert their dominance or weight, of course, right? That they're a massive trade partner.
Yeah.
But within that, I can sense that they have a special relation with us. Other countries that have their shit more together than us, wish they had that level of involvement with China. I can tell you that for a fact.
Do you think that the Peruvian government takes full advantage of that unique relationship?
No. I as I told you, I was close to the embassy staff like when I lived in Beijing, between 2016 and 2017. They know that we enjoy a pretty good relation with them.
Yeah.
But I don't see Peru making the same efforts at the same level as Chile is doing or as Mexico is doing, right? I think we would benefit from integrating a bit more, on many fronts, right? For example, the Chinese are they're hungry for natural resources, of course, right? They come and they're mining interests here and whatnot. But I think beyond that, right, there is, if you kind of like, you don't stop at the macro level, right? Because at the macro level, you see commodities, right? You see oil extraction, you see like fishing rights and so on. But if you see more at like the consumer level, there is a level of similarity, right? Like they, like Lima, Beijing is a migrant city, mainly from people in China, right? So it's largely a migrant city. Lima is a city of migrants as well. Most people in Lima are not from Lima. They're from elsewhere in the country. Like there's a number of things that are very similar. And when you visit, when you see the way they behave, like this kind of like family centric view of the world, right? Like how they're kind of like striving to get ahead. There are very astonishing similarities. And I think that translates into market opportunities, that translates into business practices. If it wasn't because of the language, I think we would be a lot closer together. Yeah. I think honestly there's a natural fit there.
And is that natural fit unique to Peru, or could you also make that same comparison with other countries in Latin America?
I don't know, to be honest. I'm not sure. I don't know how that would pan out with other countries. I don't know.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking of market size, back to the macro level, right?
Yeah.
As you were mentioning, if you're solely focused on economics, of course, you're looking at Brazil and Mexico, right?
Exactly.
But no, interesting to hear what has been the anecdotal impression. What else do you see as opportunities for that relationship between Peru and China to deepen? Because ultimately, you have that migration base, right? That wave of Chinese that came over,
Right.
and also you have that that's reflected in Chipas today, for example,
Right. Exactly.
And which is that mash up between Chinese cuisine with Peruvian flair, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
And then
Cantonese cuisine. Yeah. From Guangdong.
Cantonese. And so also at the same time, you have, of course, Chinese products that are here, like all the tricycles
Absolutely.
are from China, right? It's very noticeable. Lifan, I believe is the brand.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, you have these different touch points of obvious interaction or engagement or connection with China. Where are the Chinese tourists? Or
Oh, they certainly are here in large numbers as well. They're very interested in Peru. They see Peru as a destination that they like to visit, and you see that in the main sites like Machu Picchu and so on, right? They do visit Peru. It's a little further away than other destinations, so that's why the volume, the flow, right? The inflow of tourists is perhaps lesser than Europe or Australia, but they are interested. I have come across people who have been to Peru.
yeah,
And I would say, going back to what you were saying about like, the connection between markets and the Chinese are very customer centric. And in a funny way, because their customers, you know how every company strives to be more customer centric and meet the needs of the client. The Chinese are very intuitive about this, right? Like they cater to what consumers want, right? Which is more convenience. So for example, last mile delivery in China, right? Very, very, they have a very strong game. E-commerce, very strong game. Logistic network, out of this world. The reason why I'm now working in digital transformation is because the time I spent in China. Is because what I saw there, I had not seen anywhere else in the world, right? And lucky enough to be a well-traveled individual, I have not seen, next generation, payment, platforms. I had not seen, sharing platforms like Mobike or virtual wallets like WeChat. That is very unique to China, and that's extremely customer centric. They have this kind of funny way of just catering right to what the customer wants, right? They have this no bullshit approach,
yeah,
right? Like, and they of course they have the manufacturing muscle there, right? Like, so anything you have in your mind, you can have it prototype and made, right? And produced and manufactured. So you find really funny things when you go on Taobao, like blankets for two people, this kind of things, right? Very funny things, like small things that makes them, like they're extremely customer centric. What you see here in transportation, I would say is already a sign of like the two countries, their economies kind of becoming more interlinked because, just to kind of like wrap this up here, like how in China, you don't just have, everything between motorcycle, a pedestrian, and a car.
yeah.
All those spaces are filled with different sort of forms of vehicles, right? Like scooters and so on, right? So what we see now is actually what's permeating a bit of that, right? I used to own an electric bicycle in Beijing. It was the best thing ever. I beat traffic all the time. I miss one here, I wish I owned one. And I'm sure that won't delay because people will see that as a growing emerging city in an growing city in an emerging market. We have the challenges that most of them have, right? Overpopulation, poor urban planning. So they hold the solution for a lot of that.
As I understand, the tricycles entering into traffic patterns here in Peru, that's a result of a presidential initiative in the 90s, right?
Through cycles, meaning like
The tricycles, the motorcycles with three wheels.
right.
You see we would call them tuk-tuks, right? Of course.
Right.
They came because of some presidential emphasis
Back in the
from
90s.
Peru to call them over. Thinking about that bilateral relationship between Peru and China, have you met many Peruvians who have spent time in China and then have come back here, or even in Asia?
I've met many Peruvians living in China. Yes, perhaps more than I expected to ever meet. Right. There are definitely not that many in Singapore. Singapore's a different ballgame as well, right? It's more like corporate. It's more profit driven. Immigration to Singapore is a lot more selective. So I would say back when I lived there, up until 2016, the Peruvian community was maybe about like 200 strong max, right?
In Singapore.
Yeah. That number easily quadruples, if not more, in China. And the reason is that China gives out a lot of scholarships, right? And what's interesting to me is that you find now you can go to Chinese universities and you can see Latin American students studying their full undergraduate, not postgraduate, undergraduate degree in Chinese. And that to me is China flexing a bit their soft power, right? Because these scholarships often include a year of language training. So they come first to China to get language training, and then they do the university degree. And of course, for master's degree and also for PhDs, that's also the case. I've met Peruvians studying, physics degree or engineering PhD in Chinese in China, right? And many of them stay on. I know a handful of others, 3 siblings. I started a restaurant in Beijing. So there is a Peruvian community there. Many of them benefited from the help or scholarships from the Chinese government to move to China, and they eventually made their home there. So there's a pretty large community, and Peruvians from all walks of life, right? It's actually a very fair representation of Peru, which you don't often find.
So talking about Peru and how centralized it is, especially here in Lima, right? Almost 1 out of 3 people in Peru live in the capital region.
That's right.
Can you talk a bit about what you've seen in terms of scaling for some of the startups or SMEs that get some initial traction here? You said something interesting the other day, which was, once they reach a certain inflection point here in Lima, then they look to like Santiago.
That's right.
Or they look to Bogota. They don't necessarily look at expanding across the rest of the country.
That's true. I would say that when you mentioned, right, like it's 32 million people here, right? The population is 32 million strong. That number you need to take it with a grain of salt when you look at market size, right? Because the Peruvian market is not 30 million strong. I mean, you look at Lima, the availability of services that you have here is definitely not the same as what you have in Arequipa or Trujillo, just to name other top tier cities, let alone smaller ones, right?
Sure.
So and even within Lima, right, 10 million people, I would say that the number of opportunities, that the service level that you encounter in a few central districts here is way more numerous, right, than what you find in the outskirts. So Peru is actually a small market, and that reflects in the the route that some startups take, pursuing growth, right? That's right. I mean, so once they gain traction, they get some nice revenue coming in. Most startups would feel like it's a natural next step to look at Santiago or Bogota, and that's because those markets they're more similar to Lima, right, in terms of size, purchasing power. They're not that thrilled at the prospect of expanding in Peru. You maybe perhaps global is somewhat regional in Peru, right? But I don't know any other example. I mean, You don't find Uber in other cities yet. I don't know if in Arequipa, but like they look at market opportunity. They look at, where can I find a large number of potential clients that have the money and the accessibility to buy my products, right? Take a trip 3 hours east of Lima and tell me if you can have a conference call or the bandwidth, the internet connectivity becomes dramatically poor very fast outside Lima. How are you going to sell people stuff online? If 3 hours, inland, they have poor connectivity, right? So I would say if I were to come up with a recipe of sort of like enhancing the marketing Peru, I would say enhance the market, but making those that are outside the current norms. That's a very high entry level cost, right? Get them in. Peru could be a 30 million strong market if everybody had access to, high speed broadband. If there were, telecom operators serving the whole country, if there were, banking services available to people, everywhere, not just in the large urban centers. I think that's what limits us, to be honest. And I wouldn't blame a startup wanting to go to Santiago or Bogota after Lima because, you're pursuing growth, right?
Yeah, it certainly makes sense from that perspective.
Yeah.
But the service gaps that you mentioned are quite vast, right?
Yeah.
It's not something that you can roll out in 2 or 3 weeks.
Certainly not.
And so I wonder what then might be the role of not just the public sector, but the private sector as well in trying to address those market needs and those gaps.
I see a very healthy trend in that sense, actually, because even if you look at it on purely economic terms, right? From a purely economic standpoint, if you want to sell more products, right? If you want to increase sales, you need to somehow bring these people up, right? I'm talking about the bottom of the pyramid. I'm talking about underserved populations, right?
Sure.
So I see real initiatives. I see large conglomerates, because how Peru is big on conglomerates, right? The chabols are kind of like, that's how we roll here. So you have large conglomerates, Intercorp, Breca, and so on. They're umbrella names for groups of 10, 20, 30 companies, right? Across the entire spectrum of economic sectors, right?
Yeah.
And so many of them are actually making a move to include, right? Provide maybe health services or, schools and so on. And that, in a way, even if you think about it in purely economic terms, makes sense. Because, the more services you provide, right? The healthier population you have, the more educated you have, besides your normal sphere of influence, the more potential clients you end up having, right? Because, hey, healthy, educated people are likely to become productive members of society, earn money, pay taxes, consume.
Sure.
So there is a great deal of interest in that. They see that as an opportunity.
So where does your work fit into that vision? Because you focus on UX and human-centered design.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about what is the, let's say, current state of those areas of focus here in Peru? Like, how many people are working on those domains?
I don't know the numbers, but I would say it's not saturated, right? I would say, some large companies, like I know some banks that are only maybe 2 years ago started hiring for UX designers, right?
How many years ago?
2 years ago.
2 years ago.
Some large banks only started hiring for UX 2 years ago. Like, they're very novel positions, right? A few of the conglomerates have set up their own innovation labs. You see, La Victoria Lab, which belongs to Intercorp, right? They have a very strong partnership with IDEO. Then you have Brain, which is part of Breca. They're pumping in some significant resources. I would say that there is an opportunity in that whenever you're trying to create a product for a demographic that you know little about, unless you're very close to them and unless you gather some significant data about them, unless you build some deep understanding of their needs and priorities and ambitions and patterns of behavior, and then you're likely to fail if you don't do that, right? So I think there is some opportunity for companies trying to perfect products that could feed the needs of people, underserved populations, in getting to know them. right? So just to talk a little bit about what I do, I try to position myself, or I position myself in this gap there usually is between the market demand, right? Like the consumer profile, the what their needs are, their aspirations, and so on, and the product development. So what I offer my clients is actually the opportunity to gather more data. I use ethnographic research and so on. I use some UX techniques. I have a background in social science, so that helps gather information from the people they want to engage with, right? And feed that back into the production process, the product development process, right? That's part of what I do, and I think there's plenty of opportunity for that. Private sector, I think, well, some of the companies that I mentioned, they're catching up, they're catching on to this, and I see some pretty praiseworthy efforts to cater to that demographic, right? Another thing, just to quickly wrap up, is that you see now more money outside the traditional sort of like, say, concentration points, right? I would say that in a way, right, like this desire to cater, right, to underserved populations also responds to the fact that now there is a lot more money in places where you used to think that there isn't. And just to give you a quick example, I remember speaking to the Bank of Singapore, which is what I think probably Singapore's flagship private bank, right? And this was back in 2013, and they were interested in operating their products. One of the few banks in Asia or in Singapore that was interested in clients establishing a client base of wealth management in Peru or Latin America. And the reason is they said, you know what? The thing for us is that, we go to the old money, right? In countries like Peru, they've been banked for generations already. Like, they're the Credit Suisse or Julius Baer type of guys. They're not going to come with us, right? We're Bank of Singapore. They go to the new money. They go and knock on doors at people whose profile you wouldn't quite traditionally match with affluence, right? So Bank of Singapore knew of this 5 years ago. I think it's only normal that you find local companies also approaching, different pockets, right, of the population, because there's money now everywhere.
So you're saying then that the sophistication of these products is deepening, whereby the organizations realize that there are new sources of capital that are emerging as potential customers. And so they have to think a bit more, well, they have to think less conventionally.
Absolutely.
In order to try and find those new avenues of capital.
Exactly. Yes. So people who concentrate wealth nowadays, in large numbers, are not traditional profiles, right? They maybe they build their own fortunes, right? Like you find that a lot, and you see that people derive a great amount of pride in progressing up the social ladder here. We just saw that at a restaurant that we were at. You remember that little
right.
sign?
So
right?
we had a wonderful ceviche lunch and also chicharrones, not just ceviche. And it was at a place called Ceviche de Ronald.
Yeah, that's right.
And there was a sign on the wall, which I'll ask Diego to read.
In Spanish?
In Spanish.
Okay, it reads, Esta barra nació como carretilla y a mucha honra. Ceviche sentimiento, arriba Perú.
And in English, how does that
so
translate?
that would roughly translates to this counter or this establishment was born as a carretilla, which is like a street trolley, right? And they're very proud of it. Ceviche sentiment. So that goes to show, right, that they're proud of their roots as street peddlers, as street merchants.
And we had a chance to speak to somebody there.
Yes.
And they said 7 or 8 years back.
That's
right?
correct. Yeah.
And this is kind of unique because in the course of my conversations here in Peru,
right,
I've heard almost the opposite, which is people try and stay as informal as possible. And so even if they reach a certain point whereby they're compelled to report on their income and pay taxes, they might just shut it down and start up a new company until they reach the certain point again for reporting requirements. And then, of course, if you look at the number of SMEs here, it's like 98% of the economy. The majority of that, of course, are like micro enterprises.
Right.
So to see this story on the wall And because, somebody had to decide to put that story on the
Absolutely.
wall, right? It didn't just happen.
Yeah.
And it kind of bucks that narrative that I've been hearing about here in Peru about these companies solely staying in the informal economy. So I wonder what's different in this instance, right?
That's a good question. Like what you mentioned is right. I mean, I do also come across a number of cases that, that show very little interest or reluctance, to lack of a better word, of fully coming clean, right? Fully becoming part of the formal economy. But at the same time, I mean, you have conflicting narratives, right?
Yeah.
That's the funny thing. That's the fascinating thing about a country like this is that, there's not just kind of one way of thinking or approaching a specific circumstance, right? I would say there are conflicting um, narratives here because you also find people or businesses that derive a great deal of pride from having to start off informally and having grown to an extent in which they now own an establishment, right? They now, that they're now fully registered and so on. So you find both. I would say it's a bit of an epic tale, right? Of kind of like overcoming all like having all the odds stack up
Yeah.
against you and overcoming all of that. So yeah, that's
I think it also depends on what your starting point is, right? Like how much comfort you have, what's your safety net, where in the country you're coming from, whether it's an urbanized area or rural area. And it's just something you said to me before is like the cards that folks are dealt here, they take pride in having made something from a less than ideal.
Well, absolutely. No, that is
hand.
story of kind of like, coming through, and it's very powerful here. Yeah.
Yeah, so very, very interesting to see those two different narratives because I've heard much more about the first one, about, basically living and breathing in the informal economy. And I've met entrepreneurs. I don't even think they would consider themselves entrepreneurs. There was one guy I met in Pura who basically would go to businesses kind of door to door and say, is this something that you need or you want? And if the business said yes, then they would produce it in batches, right? And I said, okay, but like, there's no interest to scale it. Nope. Just do it, done with, and then take something else. We'll manufacture it and then sell it.
Right. Interesting.
I said, okay. And so that's kind of like the extreme, right? The other side is, you have a restaurant, right? Or a cart. And then somebody else sees it and they might pool the family money together to move to a fixed location. Or, if your neighbor sees you're making money off a cart, your neighbor also might try and start a cart too, right? And then you have this kind of clustering that you see in not only here, but in Vietnam more so. It's more pronounced.
You see, I think one common trait between Southeast Asian countries and Peru, for example, is that you have entrepreneurship that emanates from necessity, right, out of need. So, for example, Peru tends to rank highly in entrepreneurial rankings, right? Entrepreneurial spirit and so on. Like they rank very highly, but you have to also take that with a grain of salt and dissect it a bit, right? In that, and you'll soon discover that a lot of the entrepreneurial activity in Peru happens out of necessity, right? It's because people kind of there are not enough jobs going around, so people need to come up with their own employment.
I think that's a great point. And oftentimes people, especially from the West, they come and they don't see that extra component. They see the entrepreneurial drive, the entrepreneurial spirit, but it's not associated with, okay, if they don't sell, if they're not hustling, then they're not going to eat.
Exactly. True. No, the circumstances are totally different, right? It's not like they have to choose between a corporate recruiter coming through a campus, right? Or starting. No, it's not like that.
It's a default economic option.
Exactly. Like, that there are really just very little chances of this person to get a formal, regular job, right? And I think that's also reflected to a great extent in the level of the death rate of startups here, which I don't think is I don't have the numbers right now, but I don't think it's exceptionally high, but a fair number of startups or companies, right, that begin operations, they die within the first 3 years, right? So it's a high number of attempts that fail, and that's not surprising because you see that it's out of need. Maybe not very well prepared, not very well thought out, and it's just kind of one attempt after the other, right? And I think also that ties in with the fact that they might not want to become fully formalized, right? Because if you are going to have to attempt something several times and fail and then kind of start again, you'd rather do it under the radar, right? You know what I mean? Like, why go through the hassle of, right, registering, incorporating,
Right.
and it's failing, right? Why?
Because in case it doesn't work out, it's much easier to wind it
Exactly.
down than
Absolutely.
if you have to go through the whole process of dissolving a company. Yeah, it's a really interesting way of looking at it as well. I think last year perhaps was when I had this big realization between the seemingly different disparate markets being quite more similar, especially places like Vietnam and Egypt and Mexico. So I traveled to those three last year, and in particular in Egypt and Mexico, I saw the similar challenges. And at pitch days, like, I could see the products and services, regulations notwithstanding, they could be deployed in any of these markets or even the US in the next day, which to me was quite surprising in that sense. The connection that I think is between Latin America and Southeast Asia, of course, it might just be my own biases, but I see the business environment, I see the challenges, I see the opportunities, sort of like you said before, way more similar between Southeast Asia and Latin America than with, let's say, the US and South America, or US and Southeast Asia.
Possibly.
Yeah. Even the formalization of industries, right? In the US, everything's developed. So industries, institutions, the infrastructure. Infrastructure also needs to be reinvested in. It's crumbling a bit. But, like in Southeast Asia, new bridges, new roads, new airports. I don't know if it's at that same level here in South America.
Perhaps not as much.
But those challenges with how do you be more inclusive in the economy, right? How do you get people connected online? How do you offer financial services to people who are unbanked or underbanked? You have that similar demographic, of course, in a very different context.
And in much larger numbers. Yeah.
Well, yes and no. The population sizes between Southeast Asia and Latin America are about the same. It's between 620 and 650 million people.
Right.
Of course, on the macro level here, you see, hey, everyone speaks Spanish except for Brazil, right? But it's a bit more complicated once you go vertical to vertical or industry to industry, right? Especially the terminology, the words, the phrases are different in each country, even in the same industry. In Southeast Asia, you have at least 10 different markets, right? And all different languages, all different styles of governance, all different economic baselines.
Absolutely.
But I do see the opportunity to share and to co-create and to do more exchanges between the two places.
One of the things that one of the things I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think there's plenty of commonalities that they should be exploited. They should be tapped into. I see a couple of differences though, and I would like to elaborate a bit on a few, which are I think infrastructure wise, Southeast Asia is doing a lot better. I think that's my take, right? You have a strong network of airports. You have low cost flights everywhere, right? In the same way almost as Europe has, right? I don't think you have that here. And that's a big problem. And the thing is, here is a world, just one big chunk of land. Southeast Asia is a lot of archipelago and island and right.
That's a great point. Yeah.
So they managed, right? Despite their geographic complexity. The other thing is safety, right? I think that the crime rates are high here and some are alarming in some ways.
Yeah.
And that's something also that impairs business, especially when I'm trying to reach the consumer, right? And I'm a B2C guy, right?
Yeah.
That's where my orientation lies. That I want to solve problems for the people. And one of the biggest constraints that I see here is that it's very difficult to kind of trust another person if you know like there is such a high crime rate, there is high potential for high risk for robbery and theft, right? So that's difficult. For example, like there is this one startup that I recall from Berlin, or Helpling. What Helpling does is it's like a marketplace app for house cleaners.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to let somebody in that you do not know, and you have to let that person into your house. They're insured for the time they're working with you, right? So if they break a jar and whatnot. But you have to let them into your house, and you have to trust that they will just clean professionally and they leave. I see that, and this is my own bias, I see that very difficult to pull off here. Convincing somebody in Peru to just open their door to a stranger to come in and clean, I find that difficult. Maybe I'm wrong, and I would love to be proved wrong. But high crime rate and low safety, to me, equals low trust in the other person. And where there is little trust, I find, for example, Gojek, right, in Indonesia. That would be a cool solution here, right? Forget about cars, go on a motorbike. I've used Gojek, amazing, right? You had to get a ride for under €2, like very cheap, very like practical, right? They even gave you a little net for your head if you don't want to for keep clean, right?
For health reasons.
Exactly, for health reasons. Then somehow you need to trust that the person who's gonna drive you is not gonna take a detour and take you to some dead end and leave you bare naked, right? I mean, safety, I think, is a big issue. It impairs markets.
I agree with you in the sense. Well, I mean, I can't speak to house cleaners in Peru or not,
right.
But I do agree with you that, at least in my experience in Asia as a whole, it has been much safer than here in Latin America. The numbers speak for themselves.
Absolutely.
This is one of the murder centers, not Peru specifically, but Latin America is one of the murder centers of the world. And you don't have that. Of course, it's very highly concentrated in places like Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Venezuela. But in, especially Hanoi has probably the safest city I've ever lived in.
Wow.
And I've lived in about 10 cities in international.
Right.
Never felt unsafe in Hanoi. Now, of course, I'm a big guy, right?
People will think twice before trying to.
Yeah, and a foreigner, of course. But really interesting comments on that, and I agree. The geography does, of course, influence what are some of the strengths and the natural gravitation towards opportunities in places like Southeast Asia and Latin America.
It's a basic, I would say. It's a non-starter, right? Like if you lack safety, right? If you lack that component of not being robbed in the street, it's very difficult for any new novel idea to flourish if it involves services, right? Because services involve, especially if they're kind of based on an app, right? If it's a marketplace thing, they involve trust, right? It's really difficult to have that without some basic level of trust.
Okay, so as we draw to a close,
right.
I always like to give the interviewee an opportunity to talk about something that I didn't ask. So if there's anything you want to share, but I didn't ask you about, this is a time to do that. It can be about you or Lima, Peru, your time in Asia, or it could even be something general as what's the best advice you've ever gotten. So it's very open-ended.
Right.
And this is your opportunity to do that.
Wow. Okay, good. Well, in the vein of everything that we've discussed here, I mean, I'm an optimistic person, right? And I see that despite of these limitations, right, that we have here, I find that the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in Peru, especially the tech entrepreneurial ecosystem here, to be very interesting, right? And I think that Peru has always been a place, that it's a very boutique place in some ways, right? If you look, for example, at agribusiness, right? Like we don't compete with the production might of South Africa or Brazil, but Peru has some very niche products, right? And I think to an extent, funny, this is kind of like my own rendition of events, right? But I think to a large extent that also translates into people, right? Like, so you don't have, large numbers of let's say, English speaking engineers here, right? For example, so that Intel would set up here instead of Costa Rica. You don't have that, but you do have, some very smart creative folks that have, attained some level of success elsewhere, and they're trying to make it back here. And I think that what makes it interesting, right? So it's really not about vast numbers. It's really not yet about scale. It's about the small things starting out small, right? I think that's what I see after spending so much time abroad, and I would think I would think that's our strength, to kind of play to the niche.
It's certainly, I think, something that you wouldn't have been able to say 5 or 6 years ago, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And it's only because of the time you spent outside, the experiences you had in Asia that helped you to come back and see what are some of the strengths and opportunities for positioning here.
Absolutely. No, yeah. I mean, I think, now I look around and I see business opportunities rather than depressing pictures, right? I used not to be the case back when I was younger, again, because of my upbringing and
Sure.
British school, university in Europe and so on, right? Like it's sort of like my map, my mental map was different.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm very glad I got rid of that, largely because of my time in Asia, but also having, lived and worked elsewhere.
Grown
So
older,
yeah, I'm grown older. Absolutely.
More
And I think, adds a little flavor to my assessment, right? I think.
Well, super. On that note, thanks very much, Diego, for not only sharing your assessment of where Lima is today and, of course, Peru, but for sharing some insight from your experience in Asia and, of course, talking about that ever important China-Peru relationship and really trying to figure out, what can the role of Peru be in the future. Very exciting stuff to see. I'm
Absolutely.
certainly looking forward to my next trip back to Peru. Of
Absolutely.
course, I'll have to check out the south because I've only been in the north and the capital.
That's very typical, by the way. Usually people just travel to Machu Picchu.
Well, I didn't do that this time.
Right.
I definitely have to come back. Until next time, thank you and take care.
Absolutely, Andrew. Thank you very much.
I always enjoy meeting people who have lived in multiple cities and continents as Diego has. Since our interview, he has deepened his professional endeavors in the corporate innovation and digital product space as a member of Globant's product studio in Lima. Muchas gracias, Diego. I hope you'll join me next week when we speak to the co-founder of a fintech startup specializing in foreign exchange. Thanks for listening.